So you said you specifically don't like proof of stake.
We did a whole episode on that,
I
didn't
know.
we?
Not everyone will have listened to that one. So let's get back into it. Why is it you don't like proof of stake? What are its flaws comparing it to Bitcoin?
Yeah, so I definitely suggest people check that out for a much more in-depth analysis than we can do here. But I will give you certainly the one-sentence version. Actually, someone phrased this way recently, and I really agree with it. You could describe proof of stake in 2 words: shareholders vote. And guess what? That is how the world works already. And for my part, the whole reason I got into this space 5 years ago or whatever it was to do something different. Like I want to build a system that at least has the potential to be democratizing and move towards decentralization, censorship resistance, these properties that we care so much about. And I think proof of stake is a huge step in the wrong direction. So that's the really short version.
So what do they get to vote on, and how do they vote?
They vote. So here's the crazy thing: they vote. They being again the validators, the stakeholders, and they're the same. They're one and the same group in proof of stake, which they're not in proof of work. This is something else Nick and I talked about, and we should zoom in on this because it's a really important point. There's kind of 2 separate classes of actors in proof of work, whereas in proof of stake, they really are one and the same. They vote not only on which transactions to admit in the order, right? So that's just the block construction piece. But here's the key thing: they also vote on the next set of validators. So there's this kind of circularity to it.
Okay, so they vote what's in the block and the order. How can that be corrupted? How many validators are there? Does it come through collusion?
Okay, so I mean,
what is the risk here? What is the risk here? We know with Bitcoin that the miners are essentially financially driven. They will just pick up the best transactions and build the blocks and move on. And yes, there are sometimes requirements. We have seen that with OFAC.
Well, yeah, it's more complicated than Bitcoin. Yeah. You have to address pools. Yeah. You have to address these nexuses of centralization. There's layers on both stacks, the proof of work stack and the proof of stake stack. So we can't be fully utopian about Bitcoin either.
No. But let's talk about the both. So let's talk about how Bitcoin does it first. Then
I think that's a good idea because it's simpler.
Yeah. How does Bitcoin do it?
Well, in my view, you have different layers. So one layer is the literal physical infrastructure, and that's physical ASICs, and then energy, and then other ancillary infrastructure, and those are organized within corporations. And many of them are publicly traded. So there's, definitely points of leverage and centralization there. They then submit those transactions to pools, which do the block templating and the block construction. And so if you were looking for, points of centralization or government influence, it could be at either one of those layers, right? And so I would say those are really the 2 key layers. I don't know if you would identify.
Yeah, and I think to be fair, especially with respect to the first layer, Ethereum has had a leg up here, right? Which is because of the fact that ASIC manufacturing is much more centralized than GPUs. And now, to run an Ethereum validator, you don't need any specialized hardware at all. And also with respect to energy consumption, right? So this is actually one of the very few arguments in favor of proof of stake that I do agree with, right? Bitcoin miners, proof of work miners have a very large energy footprint, whereas proof of stake, validators, you could spin these things up as VMs anywhere, you could move them across the world, but there's no energy signature. So that is one benefit to proof of stake.
So they're more identifiable and they're less mobile.
Well, but what is the benefit to proof of stake? Because if you haven't got the energy cost, you haven't got the input cost to create the money. We haven't got them. Well, as Nick Szabo says, everyone knows unforgeable costliness. You don't have that.
I totally disagree with that, actually.
Yeah, so you disagree with that?
Yeah, so I think proof of stake is costly. I think capital is a cost.
Yes.
You can use that
opportunity cost of the capital that's locked.
Yeah, and so money has a cost. It's called interest, right? So there is a real cost to locking up, let's say, $20 billion on Ethereum. That could have been deployed to anything else. And I would compare it to government debt, basically. So think of Ethereum staking as the blockchain equivalent of T-bills. In the real world, when interest rates get really high, the sovereign interest rates get high, it crowds out private sector spending, right? This is a very well-documented thing.
It's kind of what's happening now, or starting to, right?
This is precisely what's happening now. It means there's less activity in the real economy because everybody's just parking their money with the government and getting paid for that. Same thing in Ethereum. Ethereum, the protocol, pays you to park money with them. That means that money could have been doing something else, anything productive, whether it's in the blockchain context or in the real world. So you have to understand that that's basically a cost because it's an opportunity cost. The capital could have been deployed to like build nuclear power plants or windmills or something. So as like a capital allocator, I assure you, capital has a cost. It's a real resource, and there's a finite amount of it. It's not as obviously evident as electricity or silicon, but it's still a costly good.
There is still so I agree with that very strongly. So thank you for making that point. I do think there's still a difference to highlight. I think I'm going to keep quoting people who are smarter than me and more eloquent than me today because it's helpful. So like Lop said this recently on Twitter. He said, proof of stake is rent seeking. Proof of work is meritocracy, right? And there's some nuance there, and we could pick that apart. But I think the basic idea, and I say this as someone who has been doing this and has done both forms of mining, proof of stake is kind of set it and forget it. You kind of spin up these validators. There's some very minor degree of maintenance required. You have to install patches and make sure your keys are secure and things like this. But relative to the cost of proof of work, the kind of ongoing maintenance cost, it's low, right? Whereas with proof of work, as you guys know, the miner hardware, the ASICs depreciate very quickly. They have, I don't know what the full lifespan is, but it's
today it'd be like 5-ish years, you would say.
Yeah, and better hardware comes along, and you have to constantly chase the cheaper source of power. I guess that's probably the larger cost. So,
well, there's a point in that as well. There's the competitive nature of Bitcoin mining. What does that give you that proof of stake doesn't? What's the benefit of the competition within the mining?
Well, it's a very powerful benefit because it means first of all, it's a very free market, open, competitive space. There's no way to get a strong, enduring advantage.
Someone could come in tomorrow, and this has happened historically, and just build a better ASIC that's 10x better or something, capture the market as they deserve to. That is not possible in proof of stake.
Well, but it's not even about the ASICs. The ASICs are pretty commoditized. There's actually a bunch of suppliers now. I'm not as worried about that. I mean, I would just say historically, there's been no miner that has super dominated.
Right.
There's no one that's that dominant. In fact, there's a ton of churn. So I would put that a point in favor of proof of work.
We did have one, didn't we? Like 8-9 years ago, someone was like approaching 51%, and they walked.
I remember that they walked it back, didn't they?
That was Ghash. That was a pool.
Ghash. They walked it back, didn't they?
Difference between the miner and the pool, but yeah. I mean, the pools is something people have historically pointed to in terms of like these nexuses of centralization. But on the miner level themselves, the biggest miner in the world is probably GDA. They don't have that much hash rate. The biggest miner publicly traded in the US is probably Core Scientific. Again, if you look at their share of all the exahashes, it's not that much.
And is it getting lower? Is it getting more decentralized?
I think it will get more distributed over time. It'll be concentrating now for a little bit because there's consolidation. Miners going bust. There'll be some M&A activity. But over time, there's no there's very significant diseconomies of scale once you get to a certain size because there's political constraints to how big you can grow. There's just not that many huge energy resources that are freely available. Like energy is a very globally distributed thing in terms of cheap energy. So it's just very hard to become enormously large.
I think this is a key point that people totally misunderstand about proof of work versus proof of stake. So I'm really happy you brought this up, and specifically that you mentioned the diseconomies of scale, because one of the arguments I hear above almost everything else on the Ethereum side in favor of proof of stake is the mistaken belief that there's a large economy of scale in proof of work mining, and that this is not the case in proof of stake mining. I actually think the opposite is true.
It's a discontinuous whatever. I can't
that's fair.
It's a non-monotonous relationship, right? Because yes, as you're getting to a certain scale, you probably have economies of scale in terms of like a literal, amortizing the cost of the data center. But as you get super big, now you run into political constraints. You start getting banned in certain countries. You run out of like cheap electricity. There's a finite amount of that available, a very finite amount. On the proof of stake side, I would say there are definitely economies of scale at an arbitrary size.
It's blazingly obvious to me. And I don't understand. This feels like very disingenuous on the part of Ethereum folks who have been arguing the opposite point. And again, I can tell you as someone who runs this infrastructure, I'll just make one very simple point. In order to run a validator in Ethereum, you need, as I said, kind of two pieces of infrastructure. You need this kind of like EL and CL thing, like execution layer and consensus layer. The execution layer thing is very heavy. Okay, this is validating the entire Ethereum blockchain that has been running since Genesis, and it there's hundreds of gigabytes, and you need a fairly powerful system and high bandwidth, et cetera, et cetera. However, here's the key thing: the consensus side is very lightweight. Okay, and you can run an arbitrary number of validators, as many as you want, hooked up to a single piece of infrastructure that does like the execution layer side. And so you're amortizing, and again, this is just economics 101. You're amortizing the cost of that execution layer client over potentially dozens or even hundreds of validators. That is the definition of economy of scale.
I mean, the other more abstract
Hold
version.
on, why would they want to deny that there's an economy of scale?
They will say that the rewards you earn are directly proportional to the number of validators you're running, which is to say to your stake, right? So if you double your stake, you earn double the rewards.
Okay.
And that is technically true, but it's only looking at the capital cost piece that Nick spoke about. It's not looking at the operational cost.
But why is an economy of scale, why is that a negative?
It's bad because
it leads to centralization.
Over time,
Oh,
you'd
right.
have a few large entities doing
Right.
all the
It-
validation.
They
economy of scale, by the way, is just the rich get richer. It's
Yeah.
the same.
No. But I'd like, so what you're saying is they will push out other validators.
Yeah, so obviously it's bad if there's like a tiny handful of validators, whether it's proof of work or proof of stake. Empirically, we know proof of work has not concentrated with a small handful of validators. There's a large number of validators, public, private, globally distributed, all over the place. Miners,
Yeah.
yeah. In proof of stake, in long term at equilibrium, and we'll see what happens here. If you look at the coins on exchanges, it only ever really grows as a share of the network. These blockchains, the assets get more custodial over time. And who really wields the most power when it comes to staking is the asset managers, the banks.
I think we should talk about this because this
Well,
is a key thing.
So we never finished though. What are the risks here with the validators building blocks, arranging the order of blocks, like arranging the transactions? What can they actually do? Because, yeah, like I say, an individual miner or a pool who closes a block, actually, you have to correct me. I don't know if a pool does the pool create the block or the ASIC that would.
This is an interesting point. We're talking about
so
this too.
we've struck on the key
Right.
point here, and we should talk about this in both
because
proof
the
of work and
ASIC
stake.
builds it.
No, it's really the pools that
pools that
construct the
The
block.
ASIC is just searching for the nonce. It's not.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So the ASIC builds the block. Okay.
No,
sorry.
no,
Sorry.
builds the block.
The
pool-
ASIC, they
Sorry,
literally just grind away looking
Yeah.
for the
It
nonce.
does, and then the pool builds the block.
It's
Okay.
currently happening at the pool level.
Of course, because then the pool gets the Coinbase and distributes it.
But this is a problem, right? Because now it does mean that the pools have a degree of influence, right?
Yes.
And the pools could, in theory, comply with OFAC or something like that.
Okay, well, we will come back to that. But how does I don't know, how does the centralization within Ethereum with the validators there? What can they do? What is the kind of shitty things they can do?
So I think this is multifaceted, and I think that there is kind of a political economic component to this, which again, you and I spoke about last time. We talked about the Cantillon effect and stuff, which we could talk about more today if it's interesting. It is interesting. But I do think the most salient example really is the censorship question. So I think I would say the shortest answer to your question is what they can do is they can censor transactions and they could halt the chain, theoretically. There are a few more pernicious things they could do, such as a long-range attack, right? So these are things that are only possible in proof of stake, not in proof of work, or a simulation attack, where, for example, a validator who is no longer a validator, we talked earlier about like exiting, right? So they can kind of say, mic drop, I'm done, I don't want to validate. They have to get into this exit queue. It takes some number of days or weeks or something to exit, and that's so that they can still be penalized for some period of time for bad behavior. But once they're done and they're gone...
is bad behavior.
No, I'm saying if they were to commit bad behavior kind of before exiting, you still need a window during which you can punish them, right?
Okay.
But that window has to end. Eventually, they have to be able to withdraw their funds and walk away. Once they've done that, they could then still do bad things like sell those keys, like sell their keys to bad actors. And if a bunch of validators do this, then you could have bad actors who kind of buy up these keys from exited validators who can no longer be punished because they exited. And that can be used to carry out some pretty severe attacks, like these long-range attacks. That's not possible in proof
But
of
that's
work.
all fairly hypothetical, I
Yes.
would say.
But what are these attacks?
I mean, it literally would be like... So the thing to understand is that in proof of work, every block you add to the chain, there's a provable cost to doing that, right? A thermodynamic cost associated with the proof of work. And so if you wanted to, add 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 blocks to the Bitcoin blockchain, right? You can't simulate that without actually doing the proof of work. It cannot be forged. That's the key fact, okay? In proof of stake, simulation is costless. There's no proof of work. So you can, assuming you have the keys that I spoke about a moment ago, you could build a chain of arbitrary length instantly, just like that.
Right.
Of
empty blocks.
Because the way it's called the fork choice rule, right? So if a node that was offline, right, that hasn't been following the chain, if it's presented with these two chains, there's no way for it to differentiate. It can't tell inherently which of them is the longest chain. Again, unlike in proof of work, whereas in proof of work, they can immediately tell which one has the most accumulated proof of work. So these are key challenges that have had to be considered in design of proof of stake. But as Nick said, and I agree with this, they're very hypothetical attacks. I'm not aware of this ever having been done in practice. But I will say, if the stakes get high enough,
yeah, I mean, it's something to be mindful of. But the real sort of like bad stuff that validators can do is censoring,
Yeah.
which is happening today, and MEV,